Hi, welcome to BuildPicker, I'm John. Yep, we're changing the name of the channel to BuildPicker just to bring it in line with our website, buildpicker.com. Don't worry, we're not changing hands and we're not going to change the level of information we bring to you. We just want everything to marry up across our projects. I'll talk a little bit more about BuildPicker at the end of the video. In this video I'm going to talk about the Ryzen CPU lineup. AMD have brought out a number of new CPUs, and because of their naming scheme it's slightly confused perhaps the lineup, so we thought it would be useful to get them all in one place and we can talk through the various CPUs on offer and advise you as to which ones are the best for various purposes. We'll run through them one by one, give our verdict on whether they're a good buy or not, and if they're not such a good option, suggest some alternatives for you. The AM4 socket still has a good 6 months to run, and there's a lot of good motherboards available out there as well. So these Ryzen Zen 3 CPUs still have some really good options, and they can still be a good buy today. They're not out of date just because some of them are a little bit older, or because Intel 12th generation exists. There are still some really high performance CPUs, so let's get stuck in and take a look at them one by one. So let's start out by looking at the 6-core CPUs, and we'll start with the Ryzen 4500. This is a new CPU that's been released, but in fact it's based on an aging architecture. It's based on the Zen 2 architecture, which is several years old now, and as such this CPU just doesn't perform. You can't compare the clock speeds directly to Zen 3, so ignore those, and focus in instead on benchmark results which show that this CPU just isn't worth your money. If you're looking at a CPU at around this price point, around $130, you'd be way better off with the Intel i3 12100 or 12100F. It performs much better in games, it performs equivalently or better in multi-core work, and it's just all round the better option. So discount the Ryzen 4500, it's a CPU that shouldn't have been released at this stage in AMD's product cycle. It also only has Gen 3 PCIe compatibility, which means that it pairs really badly with some of the more affordable GPUs like the AMD 6500 XT. That's a GPU that really does need PCIe 4.0 to perform, and you do get that if you opt for the Intel i3 12th generation. Moving on then to a slightly better option, the Ryzen 5500. This is another 6-core CPU with 12 threads, and it is based on the Zen 3 architecture. In effect, it's a Ryzen 5600G with the graphics portion chopped off, so you get no graphics output with this CPU. The main problem with this CPU is its price. It's around $160, and at that price point it's also one that simply doesn't perform well enough to justify its cost. You should be looking again at the i3 12100, you could even consider a discounted i5 12400F, or you should be looking towards the better CPUs in this range, such as the Ryzen 5 5600 or 5600X, which are actually still strong performers. Realistically, there's no good case for the Ryzen 5500 at the moment, so avoid that one. Moving on then to AMD's APUs. These are pretty interesting CPUs. You can see that the Ryzen 5 5600G is a 6-core CPU. Again, it's based on the Zen 3 Cezanne architecture, meaning it's a monolithic CPU, everything is on the same die. And importantly, it includes Vega 7 graphics, that's 7 Vega processing cores, to provide decent basic 3D output. You can game on basic 3D titles, things like Fortnite, on this CPU without needing a graphics card. The case for this CPU was much stronger a few months ago when graphics cards were hard to get. Now we've got good availability across the board, particularly for entry-level graphics cards that do outperform the graphics on this CPU, and as such it's harder to make the case for it. It's still a decent CPU for things like an office build, and if you do want to buy a CPU now that will let you get gaming in a basic sense while you save up for a graphics card, the 5600G is a decent option there. Only consider this CPU if you need the graphics. If you're going to buy a graphics card anyway, then there are better options like the Ryzen 5600, 5600X, or something from the Intel i5 range. That said, this CPU can make the case for itself at around $200 or less. Do note as well, it's also PCIe Gen 3.0, so don't pair it with those GPUs with the restricted PCIe lanes, things like the 6500 XT, because you will suffer significantly worse performance because of that PCIe restriction. There's also an 8-core version of this chip, the Ryzen 7 5700G. This uses the same Zen 3 Cezanne architecture, it's a monolithic die once again, and it has 8 Vega graphics processing units on the board. The main problem with this CPU is its price, it's around $300, and that means that it's kind of priced out of the gaming and basic entry-level APU market, and it's really quite hard to think of a niche situation where this CPU makes sense. You could consider it perhaps for an office build where you need a little bit of 3D capability, but you don't want to spend out for an additional graphics card. But realistically, I'm struggling to think of a place where you're not better off either getting a really powerful 8-core CPU like the 5700X or 5800X with a dedicated GPU, or else you could look to the Intel i7 range, which, if you are looking for an office build that doesn't really need superb graphics capability, you can do basic office work on those powerful CPUs, and they're a better all-round option at around $300. So realistically then, we struggle to find a case for the Ryzen 5700G. If you want a basic gaming CPU that will do graphics, go for the 5600G. If you want a powerful 8-core CPU, then you should be looking at things like the Intel i7 if you want inbuilt graphics, or if you're buying a graphics card, you can consider those 8-core Zen 3 CPUs from AMD, the 5700X and the 5800X. And finally, we'll consider the high-performance 6-core options, the Zen 3 CPUs. The 5600X has obviously been around for a while, there's nothing new there, but it has had a substantial price cut in the face of the older Lake CPUs from Intel. It's now $200 or less, and at that price, it's a really strong option. It's a fantastic gaming CPU, it has good performance, and realistically, it's all the CPU you need for a gaming PC right now. Then there's the 5600 Non-X. This is the new released CPU, and you can see the only substantial difference is that it has a 4.4 GHz boost clock instead of 4.6 GHz. Otherwise, it's identical to the 5600X. Using the automatic boosting algorithms of PBO2 for AMD mean that you're going to see incredibly similar performance between these CPUs, and realistically you should just buy the cheapest one. If the 5600X is within say $10 of the 5600, then we'd opt for that instead, just for that slightly higher boost clock. Nonetheless, both are good options, both are good value at around $200, and they'll form the basis of a good range of PCs, particularly in the gaming space. The alternatives you can consider are the Intel i5 range. The i5 12400 performs equivalently, and the i5 12600 or 12600K do actually outperform this CPU, although they are slightly more expensive. We'll do a follow-up video explaining the i5 range, so if you're looking at that, please do like and subscribe to this video, and we'll give you the information you need to choose the right i5 CPU for you. So then, looking at the 6-core range in the round, there's a couple of new CPUs that realistically we wouldn't consider, the 4500 and the 5500. There's a couple of niche CPUs there. There's the good value 5600G, which is decent for an entry-level gaming system where you're planning on buying a GPU later, or perhaps you just play really basic games where you know you don't need a GPU. The 5700G is really outclassed. There are better options around $300, and it doesn't have the performance of the more powerful 8-core options from AMD itself. Then there's the high-performance 6-core options, the 5600X and the 5600, which were good when they were released and are still good now, but have more attractive pricing thanks to price cuts. Pair them with a good cost-effective B550 motherboard, and you've got the basis of a really strong PC. If you're finding this information useful, please do just take a moment to click like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us out immensely and means we can continue to bring you this kind of information to help you buy the very best parts for your next PC. Let's move on then and look at the higher end, the Ryzen 7 and the Ryzen 9 options. Here, AMD have only really released two new CPUs, the 5700X and the 5800X3D, but it's worth looking at all the options again, just to compare them and work out where your money is best spent. First up, let's take a look at the 5700X. Again, you can see this is very similar to the 5800X in specification. It's still an 8-core, 16-thread CPU, it has the same cache and configuration, they're both Zen 3, and they're both PCIe 4.0 enabled. The only slight difference is a very slight cut in the boost clock to the 5700X, placing it just below the 5800X in the CPU hierarchy. But benchmarking shows that they perform basically the same. You can happily buy either, and you've got a really high performance 8-core CPU. At $300, they represent fair value. However, you do have to also consider the i7 12700 from Intel, although they do rely on slightly more expensive motherboards. You do get slightly more performance with the i7 chips. That said, the 5700X and 5800X are well worthy of consideration, good strong CPUs, provided you do realise you need a GPU. They have no graphics output at all. Then we come to the 5800X3D. This is the new release from AMD this generation, and it's one of the more interesting options in their lineup now. They've used stacked V cache, which is an extra layer of silicon grafted on top of the original processor die and provides an extra 64 megabytes of level 3 cache. Level 3 cache is very high speed memory that the CPU can access very directly because it's right next to the CPU processing cores. This means that this CPU is an absolute monster for gaming and any other application where large, readily accessible cache aids performance. This CPU should retail at around $450, and at that price it's just about acceptable. However, it's currently retailing up near $600, and there are attempts to scalp it as well. I'd argue that realistically, despite the fact that it is a high performance CPU, it's not worth that price. If you can find it at retail though, it's a good option, particularly if you've got an existing AMD system and this is a drop-in upgrade to your motherboard. It's probably the fastest gaming CPU that will be released on the AM4 platform. Equally, there are some very specific titles, things like Microsoft Flight Simulator, where both the CPU is the most important component for overall performance, and the CPU does outperform everything else. In those circumstances, you might consider this a worthwhile buy. Then we come to the high-performance Ryzen 9 CPUs. There's the 5900X and the 5950X. These are exactly the same as they were when they were originally released. There have maybe been some slight stepping and process alterations, but they're the same CPUs with the same performance. What's changed is the price. The 5900X is a 12-core, 24-thread CPU that consists of two Zen 3 CCXs on the chip. It's now around $400, and at that price it represents really good value. That's if you need the cores. Note that in most games you will not see any performance uplift from a 5900X versus a 5800X or even a 5600X. Most games simply don't scale with core count. That said, if you do productivity on CPU rendering or run a load of virtual machines or something else that can use multiple CPU cores, then the 5900X is great value at the minute, particularly when you can run it on a cost-effective B550 motherboard. And finally we come to the 5950X, the flagship of the Zen 3 generation for consumer CPUs. This 16-core CPU is still an absolute monster, and it's had a price cut down to around $550 from $750. If you need 16 cores for something and can't stretch out to one of the high-end Threadripper platforms, this is the most cores you can buy for your money. And again, it will run on a cost-effective B550 motherboard, making it a really cost-effective option to get loads of cores at a lower price. The considerations for these CPUs are really just that if you're gaming, you might well get equivalent performance from a much cheaper 5600X or 5800X, or you could look to Intel for the i7-12700K and get slightly more performance for the same or slightly more money. If you're looking at productivity, we'd just caution that the i7 and i9 CPUs do outperform these high-end Ryzen 9 CPUs, particularly in visual workloads and the Adobe suite in particular, because if you get one of the ones with an iGPU, that can greatly assist in processing some codecs and visual effects. That's not to say that the Ryzen 9 CPUs are bad, just that if you've got very specific needs, there may be an Intel option that works out either cheaper or better for you. Nevertheless, the Ryzen CPU lineup still contains some very strong options, even as we come into the second half of 2022. So in summary then, there are some CPUs to avoid in this lineup. First of all, don't go and buy Ryzen 3000 generation CPUs new today. If you get a great deal on them used, second-hand, then yep, I can understand that they can be good purchases still. But for example, if you're considering a Ryzen 5600 and you see a 3700X at a similar price, it's not actually the better option. For most people, for most of the time, single core speed is what dictates the performance of your PC. And those additional 2 cores of an older generation CPU don't outweigh the higher performance you get when you buy into the latest platform. So stick with the current generations where possible. You'll also want to avoid the Ryzen 4500 and 5500 CPUs. They just don't make a compelling case for themselves, and better options exist either with the competition from Intel or by spending just a slight amount more and going higher up the product stack with AMD's own CPUs. And finally, there are some really compelling CPUs still on offer. You can get, for example, a Ryzen 5600G and put together a basic gaming PC while you wait and save up for a GPU in the future. Equally, the Ryzen 5600 and 5600X are still strong purchases. They're high-performance 6-core CPUs. They do everything most people need really well. Just be aware you will need to pair them with a GPU as they have no graphics output. The 5700X and the 5800X again are the same CPU in effect and can offer a really compelling option for an 8-core high-performance CPU, although I would always cross-shop those CPUs with the i7 Intel alternatives and see if overall you can get better value or slightly better performance for just slightly higher cost. And then finally there are still those flagship Ryzen 9 CPUs, the 5900X and the 5950X. They haven't really changed, but they're still monstrous in their performance. 12 or 16 core CPUs. If you're a power user, you need a lot of cores for CPU based rendering, running multiple virtual machines, or anything else that can actually use those high core counts. They're fantastic options, and the price cuts have only made them more attractive. And they'll even pair with relatively affordable B550 motherboards, so you don't have to spend out across the system just to support them. A word of caution there would simply be just don't buy those CPUs unless you really need the cores. You're not getting any substantial performance gain, for example, for gaming if you buy them. So only plump for them if you really know you need that kind of powerhouse CPU. If you're spending the money on those CPUs, it might be better spent elsewhere on more SSD space or a faster GPU. That will probably actually get you a better all-round system if you're constrained by costs in any way. If the sky's the limit for budget though, you can get the 5950X and have one of the most powerful CPUs currently available. I really hope you found this video useful. Please do check out BuildPicker.com. What we've done there is put together the kind of information we're aggregating in this video and made it into entire PC builds with compatible parts at best value. It works differently from other sites providing builds because it dynamically alters the build lists depending on what the best value parts are that meet a particular criteria. Every day it's updated, so you can be sure of getting the best parts at the best prices. So please do check it out and let us know what you think in the comments below.